It's a full house, I'm told. It's remarkable.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to see, I say, so much interest in the issue of inequality. In a way, I can't help but say I wish that magnitude of interest had been shown last Thursday. You know, when you write something, you always hope that something will get a reaction. And when my book came out, I was actually a little bit pleased that the Wall Street Journal wrote a review of the book, and they were complaining about my complaining about inequality. I think they thought that there should be more inequality, and I thought there was less, so we had a disagreement. Let me spend a minute talking about the origins of my own interest in the subject. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which is a town on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, the history of which really reflects the history of industrialization and deindustrialization in the United States. It was founded in 1906 as the largest integrated steel mill in the world. It was a real company town. It was named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. You can't be more of a company town than that. And, but it was in some ways a very progressive town. The school system was led by somebody called Willard Wirt, who was a protege of John Dewey. So it introduced a lot of very progressive ideas. But even at the period when I was growing up, which was the late 50s, you couldn't but help notice the high level of inequality in this industrial America. You couldn't help but notice the high level of discrimination, economic segregation, the fact that episodically the parents of my classmates would be unemployed. There was a lot of labor strife. There would be strikes. What I didn't realize at the time was that was the golden age of capitalism. That was as good as it ever got. And if any of you were at Piketty's talk last week, one of the major contributions of Piketty's work is to point out that there has been a high level of inequality in not just the United States, but in most of the advanced countries, except in a short period from sometime around the 30s, particularly the end of World War II and 1980. And I'll come back and talk about what it was that was characteristic of that and what has happened since. But that experience of growing up at this high level of inequality motivated me, I mean, really engaged me as a young kid. I had intended to go on and to go study physics. That's really what I wanted to do. But the inequality, the problems of inequality, kept gnawing at me, and so I switched at the end of my career at Amherst College to study economics, and I wrote my thesis. At the time, I wrote my thesis on the distribution of income and wealth. Now, you have to understand at the time, and until actually very recently, the economics profession has been very hostile to any discussions of inequality. It's not just that they ignored it, and they did that systematically, but they were actually hostile. Bob Lucas, who was one of got a Nobel Prize, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, reflected an attitude that is very widespread. And he said, you know, one of the most poisonous subjects that an economist can talk about is inequality. So it's not surprising with that kind of attitude that economists ignored it. In the standard models that economists used before the crisis, there was no discussion of inequality. In fact, they assumed there would be no effect of the distribution of income was simply not important. Well, I published my thesis, the main chapter of my thesis, in a journal called Econometrica. And I still think, as I reread it recently, that it provided the definitive treatment of the subject. I still think people should read it. But the point I wanted to make about this is that just a few years ago, about 4 years ago, Vanity Fair asked me to write an article about inequality. And that got read by a lot more people than my Econometrica article. So the point I wanted to make about all this is that if you're a young scholar, if you want attention to your work, you ought to be publishing in Vanity Fair, not in Econometrica. But that Vanity Fair article really summarizes a central thesis of this book, The Great Divide. The title of that article was "Of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. And that short sentence, short title, really summarizes an important aspect of inequality. It's not about economic forces. I'll come back and talk about that more. It's not about economic forces. It's about politics. It's about how politics shapes our economy. And it's being shaped now by the 1%.